Vietnam, 1969. The war is winding down, but American troops must still somehow soldier on. The troop reaction to an unpopular war is a breakdown of discipline. There is drug addiction, racial tension, mutiny. In South Vietnam, the soldiers themselves question the conduct of the war. In America, the public questions the conduct of the soldiers. The war on the ground diminishes, but the bombing of North Vietnam intensifies. 600 airmen are captured. As military men and prisoners, they too must soldier on. Their prison treatment and political statements are a lasting controversy. Late 1969, Vietnam becomes a waiting war. It is winding down, but 500,000 American troops must somehow soldier on. Their dilemma, the Vietnam War is different, unpopular, but the dangers are the same.
When it comes down to it, Vietnam in its essence for the foot soldier was really identical to every other war, I suppose, in history. That I'm talking about things that a foot soldier sees: maiming, death, orphans, widows, pain, loneliness, boredom. War is boring, basically. It's basically not scary. It's basically just monotonous. Sitting around, opening up sea rations, marching from spot to spot, looking at your watch, counting the days, marking off how many days you've got left in Vietnam on a little calendar you put on your helmet. It's monotonous. It's monotony punctuated by moments of sheer terror.
The first American combat troops are highly motivated, but a war without any clearly defined front or enemy or popular cause becomes harder each year. The GIs begin to voice their frustration, anger, fear.
They drop us in and say, go get them. And that's why we take young people into war, because the higher-ups can tell you, as a young person, you're looking for peer recognition. You're looking for recognition from the people back home, and you think everything you're doing is right, and you have to do this. And no one questions as a young child. You get in there, you want to do a job, you do the best you can.
What happens is you have basically an immature human being. The average age of an American soldier in World War II is 26 years. The average guy in a grunt unit in Vietnam is 19 years old, and you have a collection of young, immature, very emotional people. And these guys tried like hell.
My second tour in Vietnam, only myself, one platoon sergeant, and one other squad leader had more than 2 years of service. So it was a fairly inexperienced army, a fairly inexperienced company that I was leading. And I think the attitudes of the people in that company were not to aggressively search out and destroy the enemy, but let's do whatever is required to do the job so that we can get back home safely.
I think if there's one important memory that I have of my time in Vietnam, it's a memory of ignorance, and I mean utter ignorance. I was a college graduate, so I suppose I was one of the most attuned people in my platoon, in my company. I didn't know the language. I couldn't communicate with the Vietnamese except in pidgin English. I knew nothing about the culture of Vietnam. I knew nothing about the religions. I knew nothing about the village community. I knew nothing about the aims of the people. whether they were for the war or against the war. I knew nothing about the tactics we were pursuing. It was a hit and miss. It was like hunting a hummingbird. You'd go to one village, nothing there, another village, nothing there, nothing there, and the enemy, the hunting hummingbird we were after, was just buzzing around. No knowledge of what the enemy was after. No knowledge of what I was after as a soldier, what my purpose was. You secure a village, you search it, and you leave, and the village reverts to the enemy.
There was, to be sure, a certain amount of joshing with the when they came through some areas where they knew the people. There was invariably the little children would shout, "OK Salem, OK Salem" for the cigarettes, or Coca-Cola or something like that. But the minute they got beyond their very, very, very tightly circumscribed circle of familiarity, it was a foreign, alien in the sense of other world. They were frightened. Anything might set them off. A pig running across the road, a chicken running out of a door. In fear, operating against an enemy that they seldom saw. And in some cases, I think it led to outlets of violence against people who could not, by any standards of warfare, be called the enemy, but just the population in general.
The military mission became to inflict casualties, and the primary reason for existence became to minimize your own casualties. And you're sort of walking that tightrope the whole time you were there. You know, when I first got there, because of Marine training, I was ready to jump off the boat at Iwo Jima, you know, and then you come very quickly to realize that the most important thing is to husband your own people, you know, to try to get as many of these people back as you can.
I saw people get blown away by booby traps. Never saw a Viet Cong. Never saw my enemy. And listening to some of the guys that had been over there for a time, and me being enthusiastic and saying, "Hey, let's go out there." And they're saying, "Hey, let's not go out there. If we can avoid it, we're only over here for a year. Maybe I better think more about what's it going to mean for my survival being here."
What does fear do to a man? What are the reactions to fear? How do we react to ignorance? I was saying that my general feeling about Vietnam was I was dumb. I didn't know anything. And I compensated for that ignorance in a whole bunch of ways, some evil ways. Blowing things up, burning huts, as a frustration of being ignorant and not knowing where the enemy was.
Troops of the 1st Cavalry Division leave a macabre signature on communist dead. The ace of spades, the death card. But the Jungle War also marks the Americans.
I really didn't think about the war or winning or losing or whatnot. I just tried to stay alive, and in the process of trying to stay alive, I'd say I became very animalistic in my outlook towards life. And I lost most of my humanness while I was there. A very blasé attitude towards life and death, an indifference to the suffering and misery that was around me. All I really cared about was seeing the light of the next day and not too much else. I just wanted to stay alive.
He sees his own people getting blown away. He sees enemy getting blown away. You know, this whole ethical confusion is the only word I can use. It just sort of mounts. And people would flash. You'd have really good people. I had one individual who was a terrific Marine who we were on this one operation, and his best friend was killed. And we made a sweep 2 days later through a village, and this guy killed a civilian sort of as payback. I mean, in his own mind, he was sort of justifying it. You take this guy off the street, you take 12 weeks pounding on him to teach him that when a man gives him an order, he obeys it. And this is the sort of thing that happened again and again in Vietnam. The individual I was dealing with, 18 years old, a black kid out of the Cleveland ghetto, had 11 days in Vietnam. The man said shoot, he shot.
Each soldier gets written rules of conduct. One dilemma, so-called free fire zones, where anyone can be killed. A massacre occurs at a village like this, a village called My Lai. A soldier who knew the area without knowing of the massacre gives a composite picture.
I knew it was a bad place. We were afraid to go to My Lai. We were afraid to go to Pinkville, the whole area. It was a sullen, hostile, unpeopled place. Would go to village among the My Lai villages, and there were never any people. Deserted, and yet there were smoldering fires. People had obviously lived there. And it was a place where men died. It was a heavily mined area. There was no tangible object to attack except the land itself. And in a sense, the area of My Lai became the enemy. Not the people of My Lai, not the Viet Cong, but the physical place, the sullen villages, the crisscross paddies, the bomb craters, the poverty of the place became the enemy.
A suspect village is searched, then destroyed. My Lai begins like this. In March 1968, Captain Ernest Medina commands a company in the My Lai area. In a briefing, platoon leader Lieutenant William Calley and his troops are ordered to destroy My Lai in the belief that only the enemy occupies the village. No enemy force is encountered. Yet the soldiers systematically kill all the inhabitants, mostly old men, women, and children. The U.S. Army estimates that at least 200 are killed. The massacre is concealed for a year, but then 13 officers and enlisted men are charged with war crimes. The American public is shocked by what is clearly an atrocity. Only Lieutenant Calley is found guilty. He is sentenced to life imprisonment. But after a series of appeals, he is freed by President Nixon. Soldier Tim O'Brien, who patrolled the My Lai area before hearing of the massacre, recalls his reaction.
I was on the one hand shocked. I thought, this is terrible. You don't kill the people. They're not the enemy. The enemy is the place. But I wasn't shocked in the sense of being surprised. I mean, after all the frustrations that we'd been through, I understood the frustrations that were felt by Calley's company, and this isn't to excuse his behavior. I hated what he did. I thought it was wrong, terrible, and I still do. I think he should have been sent to jail for life. But at the same time, as a man who was there and who saw friends die in the My Lais, I understand what happened. We didn't kill people in My Lai. Our element didn't. We didn't do it. And that isn't to justify what he did, but I certainly understand it psychologically.
The official Army inquiry stated, quote, My Lai was a black mark in the annals of American military history. The principal breakdown was in leadership. It was an illegal operation in violation of regulations and human rights, culminating in the suppression of the truth. From 1969, combat becomes psychologically harder for American troops. As the U.S. begins withdrawing, both soldiers and public become more resentful of casualties. Many battles raise loud controversy. In one, called Hamburger Hill, 56 Americans die capturing it, then are ordered to abandon it the next day. Such tactics, common during the earlier period of the war, now create a rebellious mood on both the home and the war front. As more Americans withdraw, those remaining increasingly avoid combat. Several mutinies by entire companies are reported. An extreme form of combat indiscipline gets the casual name fragging. This is the deliberate murder of unpopular officers. Among all U.S. armed forces in Vietnam, the number of known fragging incidents in 1969 totaled 126. In 2 years, these figures more than double.
We were aware that officers were being fragged. In our particular unit, our officer was aware that I felt pretty strong about some things, and so did some of the other men. And although we got to some pretty severe confrontations where there were some threats of shooting them in the field, that never had to be done. If I didn't want to go in a certain direction, if I felt that we were going to have a confrontation and shoot people for no reason at all other than to get a body count, I'd say, no, I'm scout, I'm going this way. You, officer, can go that way, but the other people follow me.
In terms of breakdown and discipline and fragging, I did not encounter that personally. I did not feel uncomfortable in moving out in front of my people and leading them. My view that it would not stem from the soldiers, but it would stem from the people who were leading them or failing to lead them in a responsible way, in a orderly and disciplined way where people could count on being treated the same way every time and fairly. And when individuals who found that they were not being treated fairly had no other recourse, then they would take matters in their own hand with the weapons that they had available to them.
Communist propaganda takes up the GI slogan, "Don't be the last to die in Vietnam." Broadcasting from the north or from secret transmitters in the south, the communists play on the GI's longing for home.
You are a long, long way from Fort Riley now, and there is no JC Cafe in town on Washington Street where you can sit around the counter eating hamburgers and sipping coffee without having to be afraid a bomb might go off. But you will learn the hard way. You can get killed here. Get out while you are still alive and before it's too late.
Somebody give me some illumination.
Drugs become an inoculation against the war. In 1971, a Marine Corps officer investigating morale says battle worthiness is probably lower than at any time in our history. Our army in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, where not near mutinous, the soldiers are dispirited and drug-ridden. At this time, 1 in 2 GIs use marijuana.
I make it down here maybe twice a day. Sometimes in the morning I'll come down here, sometimes in the afternoon. Then we really get it on in the evening.
As a medic, I had my unlimited supply of morphine. Morphine's a painkiller. I was in pain, emotional pain. That's how I dealt with it. It never affected me in how I did my duty. A lot of us were under what I would call situational stress, and we used drugs over there to survive.
I must say I did smoke a lot of pot in Vietnam. In combat, not in combat. It was the kind of thing that was just so little to do, and if you're going to get killed, you might as well be high while you're getting killed. That's how I felt.
U.S. military police attempt to crack down, but by late 1971, drugs are claiming more casualties than the war. Troop use of marijuana, opium, and heroin is epidemic. Chief U.S. Army Provost Marshal Major Thornton Ireland.
Somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of all our military in Vietnam have either experimented with one of these 3 categories of drugs or are currently using these drugs now.
On a street in Saigon, Major Jim Riley of the U.S. Army's Drug Abuse Squad demonstrates how easy it is to buy heroin.
My cohorts here, and I purchased, was 1/4 gram of almost pure heroin. And every test we ever ran of it, it comes out to be 93 to 98% pure. Now back home, heroin usually, which is sold on the streets, runs about 3 to 12% purity, as opposed to the heroin here, which is 98% pure.
Vietnamese, both rich and poor, have long used opium and heroin for pleasure. Officials often know who controls the drug trade, but only the street dealers are jailed. The heroin sells as a white powder in near pure form. Soldiers pay just $2 for a capsule that would cost $50 in the United States. Army hospitals soon fill with cases of drug overdose or hepatitis from dirty needles. About 5,000 American soldiers are wounded in action in 1971, but 4 times that number, 20,000, are in hospital for drug abuse. Amnesty is granted to soldiers who admit their addiction, The Army provides extensive rehabilitation. It says 80% of the troops overcome their addiction before returning home. In addition to morale and drug problems, the military is also threatened from within by racial tensions among black and white troops. Major Joe Anderson.
It was like drugs, a problem more associated with people located in the rear areas, where the conflicts that can flow from racial issues, whether it's over music or people gathering together to play cards or drink, they tend to pop up in those kinds of circumstances. They don't in the field because you're depending on every single person in the platoon or company to pull you through. It didn't make any difference what color I was. If I could lead them and get them out of there safely, they'd follow me, and they did.
Black Americans comprised 13% of the troop force in Vietnam, about equal to America's black population, but only 2% of the officers are blacks. At the height of the war, a disproportionate number of blacks, 28%, serve in the combat areas. Though the Army is racially integrated, there is dissatisfaction. Some blacks demand social concessions like Afro hairstyles. Washington sends a special investigator, entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. He is to report back on race relations and drug problems.
But I'm just an out loser, and I try to do my share. Go down gambling, singing when you're running low. Go down gambling, you may never have to go.
The problem is that nobody wants to be in the military. No matter how groovy it is, I don't care how long they let you cut your hair or how big a do you wear. The black man today in America can have this great communication between blacks, which is as it should be. To get that applied in the military is very difficult.
I'm gonna get me one good night's sleep, living in a home in the heart of the country.
Vietnam, he points out, will quicken social change in America.
If I didn't see this linkage of communication from black to black, then I'd be worried about it, because I'd say, those cats will never fit into the society when they go back out.
Lucretia McGee, leaving all night. It's about as close as I'm gonna get to it, baby. Peace.
In a confused war in which 47,000 Americans die in combat, there is still a need to find military honor.
The heroes of Vietnam, as I perceive them, are the kids that left their hearts and souls there, that died there. I had a kid die in my arms, and he was shot, and he was shot severely, and I was holding him, and I was saying, Scotty, hold on, we're gonna beat the bastards, hold on. And Scotty started shaking, and his eyes started rolling, and he started talking about his mother. I think in death, everyone thinks about their mother, because that's who brings you into this world. And Scotty, he died, his eyes rolled back. Before he died, he asked me to give this medal that he got 2 weeks earlier to his mother, a little bronze star. A little medal. Scotty's a hero.
Most Americans, civilian and military, want out of Vietnam. Although communist pressure intensifies, the U.S. withdraws on schedule. Half of its troops are gone by mid-1971. In 1972, only 45,000 Americans remain. The battlefield stalemate, low morale, mutiny, drugs, and racial unrest. There are too many headaches, and seemingly only one solution: to go home and leave it all behind. The U.S. intensifies bombing of the North to cover its troop withdrawal and morale problems in the South. While the air war adds to the war's controversy, so does North Vietnam's alleged mistreatment of captured American pilots. More than 600 airmen are held in the North. Some soldier on as prisoners for 8 years. 2 long-term captives tell their personal history.
On the day of my capture, I was shot down by the 37 and 57 millimeter anti-aircraft weapons. The aircraft was, as I recall, hit 3 times. There was a sort of a boom, 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 and immediately the cockpit filled with smoke. When I ejected, because of the force of the air and the speed that I was going, I was momentarily knocked unconscious.
Captain John Dramacey, a U.S. Air Force pilot shot down April 1967 near the partition line. Only half the pilots survived the crashes. This is communist film of a typical capture. Usually the pilots are taken prisoner by the local militia. Travel to prison camps is slow. This is the best time to attempt escape. Colonel Edison Miller, a Navy pilot, shot down at the partition line October 67. Miller tries twice to escape.
They found me untied, they retied me, they left. I got myself untied again, and they came in, and the guard that found me took a stick and beat me and on the side, mostly on the left side, and as a result, my left arm from the wrist on down was paralyzed. I had no control over my hand or fingers for months, and it was about a year before I regained full strength and use of my hand back.
The first time that I escaped was at an intermediate camp prior to arriving in Hanoi. The cell was essentially made of wood, and there was one section of bars there. One day I was able to dismantle the wall sufficiently so that I could squeeze through a portion of it. There were 2 guards outside of the cell. I was able to slip past them, and at the time that I got into the fields again, I managed to darken my skin with mud. I took my shoes and I put them on my back so I looked like an old humpbacked man. And I actually passed by a number of North Vietnamese peasants in the fields. It proved very effective, except that finally I came very close to an old man in the field, and he chastised me for trespassing upon his portion of the field. And when he came close to me, he realized that I was not one of his own kind and went scurrying off to get help. Finally, as I say, I was in the middle of an open area, and then the soldiers came and they captured me the next day after I had escaped that night.
Dramacey and Miller are taken to Hanoi, where there are 5 prisoner-of-war camps. Some prisoners spend up to 8 years in the different camps. The main processing camp in Hanoi is an old French prison. It is the one seen throughout these North Vietnamese films. The pilots call it the Hanoi Hilton. It is here that prisoners have their first interrogation. Two of the prisoners, Dramacey and Miller, give different interpretations of their treatment and actions. Captain Dramacey.
The Hanoi Hilton was specifically built as a prison. It was a rather formidable place. One would enter through large gates and through a hallway, and when you went in, on the left-hand side, there was a small room. I think one of the initial names for it was the Green Room. And this is where many people had their first interrogations. It was an attitude that they were looking for. They wanted to cull the people out that were that presented what they referred to as the proper attitude. If an individual went there attempting to establish what I referred to as the proper relationship being one of, I'm an American fighting man, and I have certain obligations. If they recognize that, I think that they would put a person through these tortures to break the spirit. In my situation, I was put into the stocks, and then my left hand was shackled to the right the stock or the iron bar that went over my right foot. So I was sort of doubled over. When they yanked my foot out of the stocks, I actually left some flesh on the bar itself.
We get into an argument over torture. I really still believe that. To me, torture is a very extreme form of abuse, such as pulling out fingernails, cutting off parts of the body, that type of activity. And while I was beaten a few times, hit, pushed around, kicked, tied up tightly, strung from the rafters on one occasion for a short period of time, I don't think that was torture. The POWs themselves came up with a definition that torture was only extreme physical abuse when they were attempting to get military information from you. And I think that defines it pretty well, because I don't think much of that went on. Certainly if the Vietnamese were angry with you, if you were choosing to be obnoxious in the prison system, a guard was very likely to wrap you rather severely, even tie you up rather tightly and leave you lay on the floor. I spent 40 days in leg irons and handcuffs. Of course, this followed an attempt to escape. I didn't look at that as a form of torture.
A U.S. military report says that 60% of the prisoners are tortured. Camp conditions reflect the hardship in Hanoi. Meals usually consist of cabbage soup, some rice, and pork fat. Food is sometimes withheld as a disciplinary measure. Hanoi at first described the captured Americans as war criminals. Early camp conditions are strict, with little exercise or communication permitted. But the prisoners find ways.
And then there was another method of communicating, and this was by coughing and making sounds. Certain sounds meant certain things. For example, a cough or a guttural sound. All these things had certain meanings. So there were the messages, there was the tapping, there was the coughing and the guttural sounds that we used, and there was the flashing of the letters of the alphabet by using the hands.
Hanoi now accuses the U.S. government of breaking the POW rules. It says food parcels sent to the prisoners contain tiny radio parts hidden inside items such as toothpaste. A tin of peanuts is said to contain microfilm intended for the prisoners. The microfilm details a rescue attempt by U.S. commandos at a POW camp called Son Tay outside Hanoi. But the camp is found empty. U.S. authorities deny any knowledge of the hidden devices. After 2 years of imprisonment, Miller makes his first anti-war statement. Dramesi sees such statements as aiding the enemy.
The primary purpose of the prisoner in North Vietnam was to prevent from being used politically. And I think this is the thing that some did not realize. They did not realize the tremendous effect of the psychological weapon of warfare.
I participated in war. I made up my mind the war was wrong, particularly the way we were conducting it, and I thought that as a leader I had an obligation to speak out, and was hoping that people would understand that, that it was my sincere beliefs, and therefore act on it.
350 American pilots are captured in North Vietnam when bombing is temporarily halted in 1968. Some pilots have been prisoners for almost 4 years, and will be for another 4.
We go back to the fact that the bombing ended in early '68. You're looking at 4 years when we're sitting in prisons up there and have no knowledge, actual factual knowledge that the war is continuing, except we're still sitting there in the cell. So I think there was a lot of discouragement about the prisoners as to what was going on, how long were they going to sit there.
How can you live in a place and not knowing when you were going to be getting out and be satisfied with your condition? Some had been there 7 years, longer than any prisoner in the history of America. So it was not expected that we would get out almost immediately, or the next year, or the next year. One did not know.
Spring 1972. North Vietnam invades the South. With American ground forces almost gone, the U.S. deploys massive air power to repel the communist offensive. And at the same time, it resumes bombing the North. 72 pilots are captured. The new prisoners bring to the camps a different perception of America's role in the war.
Those that came over to Vietnam and were shot down and captured in 71, 72, I think they had a feel that a large segment of the American people were opposed to this war. I don't believe those shot down in 65, 66, 67 had that feeling that the American people were that strongly in their feelings against the war. And I think that was difficult for prisoners to believe. When we would hear on the Vietnamese radio that there were these big anti-war statements, a lot of people poo-pooed them, just saying that they couldn't believe the American people would be doing that.
The release of the prisoners is now a major aspect of peace negotiations. Those captured in the last years find better treatment. Prisoners are allowed to organize camp activities. Some prisoners feel others are being politically used.
One resists to prevent from being used. Used to make, again, I mentioned those propaganda tapes. Used to prevent yourself from giving information. To prevent yourself from demoralizing everyone else. These are the kinds of things that you do to resist, the reasons why you resist.
I didn't actively speak out in any way until May of 70. By that time, I'd been a prisoner of war over 2.5 years. And at that time was the famous Mother's Day message that's being quoted all the time these days.
In a tape-recorded message, Miller says, America's mothers must face the fact that their sons are killing fellow human beings and destroying foreign countries for an unjust cause. And he adds, my personal participation in this war is my shame and tragedy.
I felt at that time that the prison conditions had changed, that among us, at least among fellow prisoners, they would know there was no pressure, there were no threats. I think all of us agreed, by anybody's definition of torture, it ended in 69. The harsh prison treatment had let up tremendously, and at that time I felt I could speak out knowing that I was doing it of my own conscience and knowing that it wasn't because of the conditions in camp, and I chose to speak out. I thought I had a responsibility and obligation that if I really felt that strongly that the war was wrong, that I had an obligation to speak out. And if it was to cause me problems in the future, so be it.
If an individual came up with the approach, for example, I can't win, or it's useless to bang my head against the wall, or it's not worth it, if those attitudes then were prevalent, if they were successful in embedding those attitudes within the minds of the individuals, then later on that individual was susceptible to making propaganda tapes, to discouraging others to resist properly. They would be the ones who would meet the delegations, present the proper approach, write the proper letters. In other words, they were helping the North Vietnamese to pursue that psychological warfare that became so all important in the conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam and the United States.
Late 1970, Hanoi only now gives the total number and names of the prisoners. Coinciding with serious peace negotiations, the prisoners are filmed receiving mail from home. Hanoi allows American visitors to meet some prisoners in a move to counter U.S. charges of mistreatment. More prisoners make statements and tape recordings critical of the war. One estimate says 80% of them make some kind of statement. Later, almost all of these say they acted under duress. On Christmas Day 1970, Hanoi permits the first filmed interview by a Western reporter with 2 captured officers.
I have flown about 20 missions over North Vietnam when I was shot down. I flew 11 missions in North Vietnam. The answer, of course, is that the war must be ended, and it must be stopped now. We've just got to stop this thing. We've had to really go to the very core of our feelings on a number of things. Loyalty, what is it? Where does it lie?
Recognizing the harsh treatment, recognizing the fact that he may very well fail and not be able to sustain himself in that very difficult and torturous situations. The individual then, who recognized the necessity to try and try again, he was the individual who really is the real hero.
I thought my duty was to my country, and my country to me means the American people. And I felt my obligation to them was more important to any titular head or any particular personality.
Christmas, 2 years later, 1972. Some of the American prisoners are filmed attending Mass at Hanoi's Catholic Cathedral. The peace negotiations have broken down. The prisoners are eyewitnesses to the first direct bombing of the capital.
While we were there, we could actually hear, and in some cases I saw a B-52 falling from the sky. We could actually see streaks of the missiles being fired at times. The bombs in some cases came very close, and I would say the attitude of most was very jubilant, very happy that it was happening, recognizing that this in fact would be the means by which the North Vietnamese would be brought to a position of compromising, and therefore our release was imminent.
The bombing lasts 11 days and nights. 15 B-52s are shot down by Soviet-supplied SAM missiles. In 8 years, nearly 1,000 U.S. airmen have died in crashes over the north. In the last days, 33 airmen are taken prisoner, bringing the number held to 566. Although peace is imminent, several of the new prisoners make anti-war statements. 5 pilots are gathered for a press conference in Hanoi.
We were only told that all our targets are military targets and that these would be the only targets that would be hit. On that assumption is the reason that we did do the missions, for military targets only.
I would like to say that not only have innocent civilians been killed in these bombings, but some of the bombing has been very close to prisoner of war camps and has also exposed prisoners of war to the threat of death. And that it is my opinion that continued bombing of this sort will only stiffen the determination of the Vietnamese people to continue their fight.
We have great sorrow, and we hope and pray that negotiations and Congress will see to it that the war was ended soon.
Peace negotiations resume, and the prisoners wait. January 27th, 1973. The signing of the Paris Peace Treaty marks the end of U.S. military activity in Vietnam, and it brings the release of all American prisoners of war. In the North, these total 566. 55 died in the North during 8 years of captivity. The prisoners finally received the word. Peace is signed. In 1 month, they'll be home. Some can hardly believe it.
And when the news came out in January of '73 that they were going to sign a peace treaty, I was really shocked because I had already decided it's going to be another 4 years. Make up your mind now and exercise and keep yourself healthy mentally and physically.
3 weeks after the peace signing, the prisoners emerged from the Hanoi Hilton. Crowds of Vietnamese watched this symbolic finale of America's military involvement. The journey to the airport takes the pilots through the bombed capital. They will soon be home from the war, but always a part of its controversy. The American prisoners begin their homecoming divided among themselves. As they leave Hanoi, U.S. military authorities are preparing charges of misconduct against some of them. At the airport, their names are called out for the last time by Vietnamese officials. On arrival home, some prisoners petition for disciplinary action against others. Eventually, all charges are dropped. Many will face severe readjustment problems. But the returning prisoners are found to be in fairly good health. The official explanation, they are better educated and more mature than their counterparts in previous wars. The prisoners were a unique factor. Toward the end, it seemed as though America was fighting the war to free the prisoners. This gave Hanoi a negotiating advantage. Unlike other wars, there are no annual reunions. Captain Dramacey with a prison trophy. He becomes a colonel. Colonel Miller salutes as he steps onto U.S. soil. He later enters law and politics. In 1973, 1,000 American servicemen are still listed as missing in action throughout Southeast Asia. By 1980, the U.S. reduces this figure to 22. Some American groups dispute this, claiming many more are still being held in the North.